Joining us on the line is Dr. Debra Soh. She's a sex neuroscientist, columnist, and political commentator. She has a brand new book out titled The End of Gender, Debunking the Myths About Sex and Identity in Our Society. It says very unsayable things in our modern moment. Dr. Soh, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start with what drove you to write this book in the first place? Obviously, one of the most contentious areas of American public life and apparently international public life is around the science surrounding gender. It has become basically unsayable to even suggest that men and women exist as biological entities and are also different in a variety of ways, ranging from brain function to the biology of actual sex organs. So what drove you to write this?
The biggest motivation for me was all of the questions that I've been receiving over the years, ever since I first started writing about this issue, and that there is so much confusion. And what's really disturbing is that the information that is being purported to be scientifically accurate, the information that's actually being supported by some scientific organizations, medical organizations, even governmental policies, are not actually fact-based. They're not actually based in reality, or as you mentioned, biology, because for whatever reason, biology is seen as hateful nowadays. So I felt it was really important to offer a resource for people, especially for parents, because I would have a lot of parents reaching out to me saying that this is in their kids' education. And when I would try to find resources for them, I would see that a lot of what's available in the last, I would say 5, even 10 years is ideologically motivated. And so I think it's really dangerous, especially to be teaching this to children who don't know any better.
So let's talk about some of the most controversial assertions by some of the, I would say, pseudo-biologists who are out there. How about the assertion that men and women are essentially social constructs? Even biology is a social construct. This is the most extreme form of the argument, that there are men with uteruses and women with vaginas. CNN the other day headlined that individuals with a cervix should make sure that they are cervically screened for cervical cancer. I have no idea what an individual with a cervix is other than a woman. So do biological men and women exist? And does the existence of intersex people invalidate the notion that there are, in fact, two separate sexes?
So it started off with gender as a social construct, which is not true. And then it's expanded to gender as a spectrum. And now it's expanded also to biological sex being both a spectrum and socially constructed, which is absolutely ridiculous. Of course, there are differences between men and women. And in terms of people for whom biology determines their gender, 99% of us, our biological sex will predict how we feel about our gender. So this does not invalidate intersex people. This does not invalidate transgender people. Intersex people, for the most part, do want to live within the gender and biological sex binary. Most of them do actually want to live as one gender or one sex or the other. And for trans people, obviously, it's just so happens that their gender is the opposite of their biological sex. But this is not to say that any of this is socially constructed.
So let's talk about the phrase that gender is a social construct. So that's been a very vaguely defined phrase. Generally speaking, there's this attempt to separate sex from gender, biological sex from gender being presumably the set of attributes that we typically assume to be more female or more male, that essentially you're talking about masculinity or femininity. So first of all, let's define gender, and then let's discuss what in gender is in fact a social construct and what is not, because the idea that masculinity and femininity are completely separable from biological sex is not supported by the science.
Right. So gender identity refers to how we feel with relation to our biological sex, so whether we feel masculine or feminine. And then gender expression is an extension of that, which is how we express our gender identity. So again, most people are gender typical. So if you're male, you're going to be masculine. And if you're female, you're going to be feminine. The second part of your question was referring to which aspects are socially constructed and which are biological. So again, it all comes down to biology and exposure to testosterone in the womb. So higher levels of exposure to testosterone are associated with more male typical interests and male gender expression. So this is regardless of what someone's biological sex is. So this goes the same for females who may be gender atypical, who are more masculine, again, are more likely on average to be exposed to higher levels of testosterone in utero.
So when it comes to transgenderism, which apparently has become the real hot button here, if you say that men exist and women exist and a man cannot become a woman, nor can a woman become a man biologically, this is unsayable. If you say this sort of thing, then you put yourself in danger of being actually banned from Twitter. So can, in fact, a man become a woman or a woman become a man, biologically speaking? Or are we just talking about people who are suffering, when we talk about transgender people who are suffering from gender dysphoria, which is a legitimate mental condition?
Me personally, I have no issue referring to trans people using the pronouns they want. I will, if a trans woman would like me to consider her to be female, I will. But that is within the caveat of there are differences between someone who is born female and someone who is a transgender woman. And similarly for trans men and men who are born male. But the thing is, as you say, we can't even talk about these differences. And I think that's really harmful to society because one, for trans rights, and I am in favor of transgender rights, I think for these communities, if they want to be taken seriously and to have their concerns heard, they can't be promoting narratives that are not based in fact and reality because people are not going to take it seriously.
So in your book, you go through a series of myths, among them that gender is a social construct. So when you talk about gender identity or gender expression, why isn't gender a social construct? Why isn't it completely separate from biology?
Well, I mean, basically all of the research literature shows that it is biological. We can look at a couple of different areas. So one area in particular is girls with a genetic condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So they are exposed to higher than usual levels of testosterone in the womb. And when they are born, they gravitate toward male typical toys and male typical behavior, even when their parents give them more praise for playing with female typical toys. So this speaks to the fact that biology really is a very strong influence, and the idea that gender is socialized by parents and caregivers and teachers and the media and society or whatever else is just not true.
So let's talk about some of the differences, putting aside the transgender issue, just between men and women more generally. So in your book, you talk about actual differences between men and women. What are the differences that we should, of course, we're speaking about on average, because there are people at the tail ends of sort of masculinity and femininity who may have some similar attributes. But when we're talking about the average man versus the average woman, what are the differences that we should take note of and that we should adjust for in sort of our social science analysis?
One area that I'm particularly concerned about is with how this plays out in dating and sex, especially for young people. They're receiving a lot of mixed messages from the media in terms of what to expect in their romantic relationships, how to go about dating. And especially for young women, I feel like they're being told a lot of nonsensical ideas, like they should behave like men in terms of their interactions with men, that they should enjoy casual sex as much as men. And I think, it's whatever floats your boat, I'm totally cool with. But if you feel the pressure to behave in a way that is not comfortable for you or that you don't actually enjoy, I feel like young people are just so confused and there's so much misinformation. And I know that you often will give advice to your listeners. So I definitely think that fact-based information is the way to go, especially dating is difficult enough as is.
So let's talk for a second about some of the myths that have been put out there in the social sciences with regard to basically by ignoring differences between men and women. You can come up with these bizarre statistics suggesting that women are wildly discriminated against in American society. Here I'm thinking mostly about the wage gap and the suggestion that because men and women have pretty significantly different preferences in terms of the kind of jobs that they like and the number of hours they want to work, that this is just a reflection of society's bias against females. Do you talk in the book, the End of Gender, Debunking the Myths About Sex and Identity in Our Society, about the differences between men and women in terms of some of the choices that they make about family and about career and how this actually impacts things like average income?
I do, to the extent of women on average preferring to have a work-life balance, and that the fact that we're not actually having this conversation in a very honest way, and that we're blaming any sort of discrepancy or difference we see in terms of the sex ratio on sexism, I think is actually hurting women because it's not helping them make informed decisions that are actually going to help them live more meaningful and content lives. So one area that I do write and speak quite often about is the sex ratio in STEM and the fact that it is not a 50-50 ratio. However, it is not due to sexism. Again, it's due to occupational differences on averages, which again go back to on average exposure to prenatal testosterone in terms of what we find interesting. And I think it's really patronizing and infantilizing to say that women who choose to pursue different priorities in their life from men are somehow oppressed.
So, Dr. Soh, you obviously are not somebody who would consider herself, I think, on the conservative side of the political aisle. I mean, you used to write for Playboy. You're not somebody who would fall comfortably into like the center of the Republican Party. And yet you've sort of been treated that way by a huge swath of the media, certainly the Twitterati, people for saying some of these basic truths. You've been treated as sort of a social outcast in many ways. Can you talk a little bit about the reaction and why it is that the radical left seems to have taken so much control in areas of science?
Yeah, and I have to say thank you so much, Ben, for all of your support over the years. I mean, you would retweet some of my columns for Playboy, so I really appreciate that. I still call myself a liberal, and I think it's really sad because these issues that I'm writing about are not partisan issues, especially when we talk about gender transition in children, which I don't think is appropriate because the research does not back that as the best way forward for these kids. This has become so polarized, and I'm thinking at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you're on the left or the right. If these children are making decisions that are not going to be beneficial to them and their health, that's really what we should be talking about. So it's very strange for me because I see many people who would have been my allies, so-called allies, maybe even 5 years ago. They really do not care for what I have to say and, in fact, consider me to be a threat. And so I think that has woken me up quite a bit in terms of seeing what the left has become. But again, I still feel at the core I do have liberal principles. So that's why I still hang on to that label.
The book is The End of Gender, Debunking the Myths About Sex and Identity in Our Society. It's a really important read. Go check it out right now. Dr. Soh, really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Ben. Take care.
I hope you enjoyed that clip from The Ben Shapiro Show. If you did, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you stay up to date on all of our future content.